transition to our next speaker, which is Steve. And he will go more into the US militarism and Russia-Ukraine conflict. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for being in attendance.
Is this yours or mine?
My own government, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. As Jesse noted, this sage observation by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is sadly just as true today as it was back then. This weekend, we honor Dr. King's radical legacy. It's an important opportunity to discuss what he stood for, fought for, and ultimately gave his life struggling against. It's important to recall that Dr. King didn't just oppose racism, but also poverty and militarism as well, what he referred to as the three evils. And I appreciate all of you gathering here today in person and online to participate in this National Day of Action that is taking place all across the country against militarism, upholding Dr. King's anti-war legacy by saying no to NATO expansion and no to money for the war machine. Yes to peace, yes to money for the saving the environment, yes to universal health care, yes to free education, yes to housing as a human right, yes to enshrining the basic needs of human life as guaranteed rights. It's atrocious how completely upside down the government's priorities are when it comes to our involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what Noam Chomsky has called a ghastly gambit. In a time of extreme domestic hardship with millions of Americans on the streets, living in their cars, living with their parents, not getting ahead, getting actively poorer and sicker as inflation and disease ravage the nation, Republicans and Democrats largely agree that we should take over $100 billion and send it right to the defense industry to provide Ukraine with materiel to lob at Russia. Aside from having boots on the ground, the current conflict bears strong similarities to our involvement in Vietnam, a war Dr. King courageously opposed. This disastrous tradition of taking half of our federal discretionary spending and handing it to the war industry at a time when we should be uniting to tackle the greatest issues of our time, such as the climate crisis, is having a terrible effect on our population and the world. Those in power seem to relish in the opportunity to throw Ukrainians into the meat grinder of modern warfare to get one over on Russia and enrich themselves and their donors financially. Senator Lindsey Graham recently expressed delight at the opportunity to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. In a bipartisan press conference last July designating Russia as a state sponsor of terror, Lindsey Graham said, quote, "I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help the Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person." This should come as no surprise from a person like Lindsey Graham, who helped orchestrate the coup in Ukraine and openly calls for the assassination of Vladimir Putin. Lindsey Graham, like many war hawks in power, wins either way the war goes. If it is somehow successful and they ultimately evict Russia from Ukraine, he will have succeeded in his project to damage Putin and allow Ukrainian nationalists to continue to wield outside influence. If Ukraine loses, he will have succeeded in ingratiating himself to his political donors in the defense industry. A year into the conflict, it's becoming abundantly clear that, as U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Mark Milley admitted, the war will not be won militarily. It seems to be that the real focus is, as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said at the outset, to weaken Russia to the point where they can't fight anymore, an extremely provocative statement in and of itself. This is truly a pointless affair that only enriches those who already have too much money and influence at the expense of poor and working class people. War is, as Major General Smedley Butler has said, a racket. It enriches large corporations at the expense of funding for the people's needs. It makes poverty and racism worse by instilling feelings of narrow nationalism and fear and hatred of people from enemy countries. The ongoing xenophobic attacks against Asian people are a direct result of our demonization of China. And any mention of Russia promotes tirades of Russophobic sentiment. We here in the West are fed a generous helping of one-sided propaganda that one-dimensionally portrays Russia as this cartoonishly evil regime run by a genocidal strongman and/or a handful of big businessmen and oligarchs who control everything. This is, of course, bitterly ironic projection, considering that in our country, the three richest billionaires own more wealth than the bottom half of the country. Pretty much every single federal representative in Congress is a multimillionaire, and corporations and the rich control the government by buying politicians, a practice upheld by the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. How come nobody has suggested seeing the war from a Russian point of view, even as a thought exercise to understand their motivations for prosecuting armed conflict? It's because these propaganda pushers don't want you to think for yourself, don't want your BS meter to go off, and just want you to sit passively and soak up everything they tell you to think and feel without questioning it. I'm not saying that what Russia did was the right thing to do. I'm asking, why is it that you're likely to be immediately exorcised from mainstream media discourse for suggesting that it would be a helpful thought exercise just to think about the conflict from Russia's perspective? I'll tell you why. It's because, for one thing, it shows the hypocrisy of our objections to the conflict. As other speakers have mentioned, we would never tolerate a foreign military alliance marching its troops and assets right up to our border, especially if that military alliance agreed they wouldn't do this 30 years ago and then proceeded to do it slowly but surely over time right in front of us, especially if we had already fought brutal conflict in this exact region during World War II, and tens of millions of our soldiers died defending and then reclaiming it from fascist control. And add this to the equation, there has been an ongoing civil war on our border since 2014, fueling this catastrophe where people in the areas closest to our border have much closer cultural ties to our country than the one they're officially a part of. And especially that an agreement reached in 2015, putting an end to the hostilities, was unilaterally ignored by the other party. And to top it all off, this whole area used to be part of our country 30 years ago. So that is the scenario which is playing out right now for Russia. They had red lines that they warned the West not to cross, and they were trampled upon. This whole thing could have been avoided if Zelensky had agreed to uphold his end of the Minsk II agreement. Again, I'm not here to convince you that Russia's decision to launch an invasion into Ukrainian territory was the right thing to do. NATO powers in the West did pretty much everything in their power to provoke this conflict, pouring fuel on the fire by materially supporting the minority Ukrainian nationalists who sided with the Nazis during World War II. This is all well documented, and you can read about this yourself in Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies' new book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. So Russia took the bait, was unsuccessful in putting a swift end to the war, and now the two sides find themselves embroiled in this virtual stalemate. And we in the peace movement must work towards cultivating a lasting and enduring peace among all nations. Not just the absence of war either, but an end to exploitation by countries, yes, but also corporations too. Lasting peace requires providing those in the Donbass with the opportunity to choose whether they want to be part of ultra-nationalist Ukraine, part of Russia, or maybe an independent or semi-autonomous state. Providing the people of the Donbass with self-determination is an outcome that respects their right to choose their own fate. we should want de-escalation between the great powers as people in the peace movement, which would look like NATO halting its expansionist ambitions, particularly eastward. As a matter of fact, NATO should disband as an outdated relic of the Cold War, which was used to counterbalance the Warsaw Pact, as you heard from Comrade CT and others. So we know now that this is part of US official military doctrine of preparing for great power war against Russia and China, which is official US military policy since 2018. For the sake of people, planet, and peace, we must stop this madness, stop this proxy war with Russia, stop fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. It's reckless, it's irresponsible, and it must not be allowed to continue any longer. Once Dr. King started criticizing involvement in Vietnam, a war started by a Democrat, the white moderates turned their backs. So too are those in power trying to cancel anyone who dares to question this government's strategy of pouring fuel on the fire of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a proxy war again managed by a Democrat. Us in the peace movement must criticize war regardless of whether it is started by or being maintained by a Democrat or a Republican. Democrats are also guilty of embroiling us in continuing nonsense wars such as Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We must not hold our tongues when Democrats act as warmongers. Doing so allows the far right to portray themselves as being the only ones against continuing the war, which is a thinly veiled attempt to try and bring the troops home so they can use them against their political opponents. Returning the anti-war movement to prominence will require reclaiming Dr. King's anti-war legacy from neoliberals who wish to whitewash his radicalism and pretend he just wanted equal treatment for Black folks on paper. That's why it's so important to participate in conversations like these where we uplift Dr. King's anti-war message and educate and inspire people to stand up and not just blindly go along with our own militaristic endeavors. And it's so important to be involved in the solution, I think, such as getting involved with local organizations doing this important work in formations like the Military Options Committee, part of Sacramento Area Peace Action that goes and talks to high school students about alternatives to the military. So we will continue to investigate all of these solutions together. And with that, I'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your attendance and participation.
Thank you, Steve.